Soldiers are fighting armed combatants in Iraq. They pursue their enemies into a forest. The soldiers inspect the vegetation and wildlife inside the forest, seeing several spiders, snakes, and bats. Eventually, someone from the enemy forces grabs their attention, and the soldiers start pursuing the combat. They shoot down the enemy and walk over to the body to confirm its status. However, instead of the body, they find a cave. Jimmy goes inside with Santino to examine it. The cave is narrow and dark. The soldiers use their flashlights to traverse through the hole in the ground, but smoke and a stench make it difficult to move inside. Jimmy places cigarette butts inside his nose to help with the smell. But something goes wrong when the two soldiers face a wall with strange writing. Santino stares at the border, while Jimmy looks at it and tries to digest the situation. Suddenly, Santino starts screaming, and the two soldiers lose their composure as something in the dark attacks them. 3 years later, there is a crime scene in New York. The police are investigating something in the back alleys of the Bronx. One cop approaches Officer Ralph, asking that he gets away from a pile of rags. The rags cover a lifeless body belonging to Butler, and Ralph drive together in their car. The two are undercover cops patrolling the streets of the Bronx. Suddenly, a distress call grabs their attention, and they decide to follow up on the police dispatcher's request for officers to check Jimmy Tratner's residence. Ralph has something like an internal radar, which seems to be an aid for him to see if something requires the intervention of cops. Butler jokes about Ralph's radar, claiming it to indicate they might be heading somewhere dangerous. They drive to the destination for the distress call. They park the car outside and go to an apartment. A shirtless man receives the officers and lets them in, as the two look for his wife. His wife, Lucinda, does not show her face despite being the one to call the cops. Jimmy wants the two men to leave immediately after inspecting the living room, but the cops persist, as they want to talk to his wife. Eventually, she reveals injuries and clear signs of abuse, giving the cops enough reason to arrest the man for questioning. As they prepare for his arrest, Jimmy's daughter appears at the door, taking the cops' attention away for a split second. Jimmy pulls out a knife as he tries to fight the cops off. The shirtless man then runs for it, understanding that the odds are against him. The cops pursue him as the man leaves the apartment building to gain distance and get away. Eventually, Ralph reaches the man by following him in his car. After catching Jimmy, Ralph shows his immense anger at the man for being horrible to his family, relentlessly beating him, until Butler takes charge and cuffs the injured man. Joe Mendoza is looking at a person named Jane's case files. He tries to grasp some new information from his evidence, but cannot make any deductions. Eventually, Joe gets frustrated and starts his workout regimen, firstly doing calisthenics indoors. He eventually takes a jog outside. Meanwhile, the cop duo is inspecting another crime scene. This crime scene is at a park and a zoo, where the other cops seem to have lost their suspect. A woman threw a child into a moat surrounding a lion's den, and disappeared into a crowd that formed around the moat. The child is safe and taken away for emergency health care, but the woman is missing. The cop duo then go through the zoo, walking with their night vision goggles to look for evidence, or even the suspect herself. They eventually split up to cover more ground. Butler walks alone in the dark through the zoo, but finds nothing of concern until he eventually reaches a merry-go-round. A bear startles him from its cage, but there seems to be nothing important for him to inspect. Ralph is looking at a cage of monkeys through his night vision goggle. The monkeys are in disarray, but nothing is unusual until a woman in horrible condition startles him through the lens. The suspect claws at the ground with her bare hands, clearly obsessing over something she thinks is underneath. The suspect is now in handcuffs, deranged. She makes no sense as Ralph tries to question her, but she mutters to herself, apparently the lyrics to a song by The Doors. Getting nothing out of her, it's clear that her mental delusion forced her to child, and subsequently led to her digging through rock until her nails gave out. Ralph tries to find out more, asking the other cops. Suddenly, a man appears from the darkness of the zoo, alarming the cops, who are surprised by the man's presence in the park. Everyone else left the zoo vacant, but this man is an important witness that can provide further insight into the case. Not responding to Ralph, the man just walks away and enters the lion's cage. Ralph walks into the cage after the mysterious man. The mysterious man disappears inside, but Ralph ensures he follows the important witness. He walks along the walls of the cage, only for a lion to eventually reveal itself through a corridor. In such a dangerous circumstance, he remains calm and points his gun at the animals as he backs away until he gets closer to the cage exit. Eventually, the standoff ends, as one of the lions rushes at the man, but Ralph ducks and slides to safety behind a cage door. The next morning, Ralph finally gets home from work, and his wife Jennifer sleeps in bed. After a night of work, he finally gets back to his family. The couple goes to see their daughter's soccer match later. Despite the long hours as an undercover cop, Ralph cares deeply about his family and tries to be present. Joe walks into the police precinct, approaching the front desk. He talks to Ralph about the woman from last night. Joe reveals that he is also an undercover cop, like Ralph and Butler, but is more of a specialist, without specifying what he specializes in. He asks the duo more about the woman, but they keep quiet. Eventually, the cops escort the woman away as she hisses at Ralph and Butler. They wait for the zoo to provide the exact footage of the woman, as the request for evidence takes some time. Meanwhile, Ralph looks at a video message from his family, clearly missing him while away at work. some other cops have an investigation request by a family to check up on their basement, as strange noises are coming from it after a paint job done a few weeks ago. Ralph looks at the request and realizes it may have something to do with the zoo incident, so he takes over the case. Butler realizes Ralph's radar is probably at play and prepares to leave with his partner. Ralph and Butler drive to the caller's location. They walk to the building door as it pours heavily. After knocking at the door, Salvador Alberghetti opens it and lets the cops inside. The house is in horrible condition, with the reports causing much distress to Salvador's family. Salvador's wife communicates to the cops through her son about how supernatural occurrences make the house a horrible place to live. Instead of trying to convince the cops through dialogue, the family decides to show them around. Firstly, the family discloses how the lights in the house only work for a short time. Oddly enough, holy candles from the church do not light up at all. Regardless, the cops accept the information and proceed further. The family escorts the cops through the corridors to see the damage. The child first shows a wall decor depicting Jesus having fallen off during the strange incident. They eventually go further through the corridor, where a cat startles Ralph, closing the cat inside a closet. The family finally takes them to the end of the corridor, revealing a door behind which evil lies, according to the mother. So the cops decide to go in themselves, to investigate if there is any truth in the supernatural haunting, and to see the evil the family refers to. The duo moves down a set of stairs with their flashlights. They hear rattling from the water pipe, but go further to inspect what is happening in the basement. They then find a lamp, apparently moving on its own. A sudden clap sound startles Butler, but Ralph looks behind the lamp to find that a rat has just fallen for a mouse trap, explaining the moving lamp. Butler feels that something is unsettling about the basement, complaining about the smell. He goes back upstairs, leaving Ralph inside on his own. Ralph inspects the room independently, looking through the many bizarre items inside. Going through hung vegetables and fruits, he eventually reaches a wall of tools when his light suddenly starts flickering. His flashlight goes off, showing a snake protruding from the wall as the room enters darkness. Ralph turns his flashlight on again, and realizes the snake is just a textured handle to a tool, so he looks around away from the wall. Suddenly something falls from the ceiling behind Ralph. He moves away and looks back, to find a lifeless, rotten body on the floor. However, the eyeballs move, as well as the abdominal area of the lifeless man's body. Flies then swarm out of the man's pupils and abdomen. The flies evacuate the man's body, but now the pale corpse lies on the ground, covered in bugs. The cops come to the house to take the lifeless body from the basement. Ralph asks the couple what they know about the man, David Griggs, asking the family more. They realize that Griggs had a partner to help with a painting job in the basement, who the family reveals as a figure similar to the man the cops lost at the zoo. The undercover cop squad is outside Griggs' apartment. They brace for possible intruders or criminals lurking inside, but open the door to reveal no sign of human life. The apartment is dark and horrid, scum and cockroaches overwhelming the rooms. They keep looking through the room, finding the man's business cards, until they see a family picture on a wooden shelf. According to the picture, Jane, the deranged woman from the zoo, is Griggs' wife. They eventually find another picture frame, finding that Griggs was in the army with two of his friends, Jimmy and Santino. Santino is the mysterious painter that the cops are currently looking for. All the cops hear an alarm from across a corridor leading further inside the residence. Bracing for a possible encounter, the cops move slowly toward the source of the sound. Ralph takes the lead and hears chains rattling from a room beyond the corridor. He hears his radio buzzing again, then faintly hears the sound of children. No one else reacts to the sounds. Eventually, the group reaches the last room in the house. The cops look around inside, moving carefully as they are unaware of what might be inside. Suddenly, a chained dog lunges at them, startling the whole crew. The crew then looks around the wall and finds the corpse of a cat displayed on a wall against a crucifix. Ralph helps his daughter get ready for school. Christina rushes along as she makes her way to school. With the couple left alone, Jennifer decides to reveal her pregnancy. Ralph is happy with the news, but Jennifer has concerns. While she is dismissive, Ralph realizes that there is an issue he needs to talk about, so he walks over to his wife to comfort her. She's worried that Ralph's duties are getting in the way of his commitment to his family. He assures her that he will remain committed to raising both their children, regardless of his work. Now Ralph is alone inside the house. He takes one look at a cross hanging on his wall, until he hears water in his indoor aquarium wobbling around. He walks over to see what's wrong when he notices a larger fish being completely hounded down by smaller fish. The fish is slaughtered, and blood flows out from its carcass. Back in the police department, Ralph exchanges his walkie-talkie for a new one, his old one suffering damage from strange interference the prior night. Ralph then walks out of the room and encounters Joe, calling him father, with Joe reminding him of his Catholic past. Joe is a priest specializing in police work relevant to religious issues. Joe wants to know about Jane's case, with a personal involvement with the suspect. Ralph chalks her condition down to lunacy, but Joe rejects the notion, further implying that this case involves the work of evil spirits. Ralph loses hope in the man of religion before him, insulting Joe's beliefs before dismissing himself from the absurd conversation. Butler is looking over military files, identifying Griggs, Jimmy, and Santino as the relevant army officers to their case. They find that the trio was dismissed from service due to poor conduct, having chopped up a battalion chaplain during their service. Furthermore, the current investigation and forensics allow the cops to draw further conclusions about what happened in several incidents. Griggs's passing has been proven to result from unforced consumption of paint thinner. Santino watched as his friend slowly put an end to his. Furthermore, later that night, Santino also watched Jane tossed away her and Griggs's at the zoo. The duo looks through the security footage they receive from the other cops after their request. They first see a hooded figure, supposedly Santino, painting over graffiti, but pay no attention to what is painted on the wall, despite the graffiti being inside a lion's den. They then see Jane walking towards Santino, working in the lion's den. The woman engages in conversation, pulling her child from her stroller and inside the moat. The visitors at the zoo form a crowd and chase the woman out, but Santino shows no reaction and just moves back to painting over graffiti. With the footage focused on Santino painting over the graffiti, Ralph starts hearing static. Butler seems unaware of this, until Ralph eventually starts hearing children's voices. Butler still hears nothing, as Ralph becomes slightly more agitated but does not overreact. The footage shows how Santino left the graffiti when Ralph called out to him. After being called out, Santino went to an exit gate, where he seemed to converse with a lion. Santino also looks directly at the camera recording the footage, obviously taunting whoever might be watching it later. All this makes Ralph more uncomfortable, until an image of a corpse flashes across the screen and surprises him. Butler does not see the same visual, so Ralph rewinds the footage, only for it to return to normal. Ralph is experiencing things that others are not, and seems to show some concern now. When his family comes home from Christina's school, Ralph opens up a beer at home. Christina is jumping about with a plushie in her hand that she got for her birthday gift. Ralph is stressed out, becoming angrier and angrier at his daughter's hyperactivity. Eventually, he snaps at Christina, prompting her to leave the living room. Jennifer approaches her husband, who has never lashed out at their daughter before, asking what's wrong. Ralph finally opens up about the stressful week he has had at work, the horrors he has seen, and the mental toll it has had on him. Jennifer is understanding, offering to listen to his problems, but Ralph does not want to talk about his work anymore. Ralph goes back to Jimmy's house. Lucinda, Jimmy's wife, opens the door and reveals that Jimmy left the home after being cleared of charges by the police department. Ralph asks about the military trio, discovering that Santino offered to paint Jimmy's office a few weeks prior. Ralph then gets permission to see the paint job in the office, and Lucinda offers to lead the way. Ralph enters the house to see the office that Santino and Griggs worked on. He walks into the office to look for anything that might serve as evidence for his case. He sees painting equipment, but no important evidence at first. Eventually, he hears about Jimmy from his wife, learning about Jimmy's mental health as of late, and finding that the man is not acting like himself. Ralph notices a pile of hard drives housing footage from Jimmy's days in the military. Lucinda leaves Ralph to continue his investigation, so Ralph looks around the office and notices something strange on the painted wall. He walks over and starts scratching the paint off, revealing a carved picture of an owl. Christina is tossing and turning in her bedroom as she hears scratching sounds. The sounds wake her, and she gets out of bed to see what is happening. She finds nothing underneath her bed, but reaches for one of her toys to sleep with. Back in bed, the scratching sound does not improve, as it intensifies and frightens Christina into running away from her room. Ralph is in Jimmy's office, scratching the paint off the wall. He has gotten through most of the wall, showing strange letterings across the revealed structure. Suddenly, his radio starts to produce static again as the lights fade out. Ralph then hears the sound of children. He now moves out of the room to see what is going on in the house, until a door and a clock make a sound to grab his attention. Ralph approaches the clock, but Jimmy pounces on him from behind. Ralph struggles, until Jimmy eventually gets away. He jumped down from the apartment roof to get on top of Ralph. Ralph collects himself after this encounter, and the lights turn back on. Ralph now watches the footage from Jimmy's drives. The soldiers traverse through the cave as the lights go out. The sound of fluttering slowly fills the room, and the soldiers lose their composure. The footage cuts back and reveals that the fluttering came from an entire barrage of bats swarming the two combatants in the cave. The swarm eventually causes strange changes in Santino, making him unresponsive until Santino approaches a wall with engraved writing. Santino stares at the writing, still unresponsive, but Ralph compares the footage to the engravings on Jimmy's office wall. Ralph then returns to the Italian family's basement, finding the same lettering on the wall as in Jimmy's office. Every place Santino has visited, he has painted over engravings of the strange writing from the cave he found during his time in the military. Ralph goes to a mental institute the next day, where he tries to meet with Jane. Jane is heavily sedated, so the doctor at reception does not let him go until Joe interjects and gets permission for the both of them. Joe escorts Ralph to Jane's cell, apparently kept inside a section of the psych ward where patients who threaten others' safety are locked up. The two finally reach Jane's cell. Ralph and Joe stand outside her cell, completely covered in darkness. Ralph asks about Santino, expecting Jane to have some information after their encounters in history. Jane went to the zoo because Santino wanted to share a message with her, not specifying its content. Jane then cowers and crawls towards a corner. Ralph asks her to further explain the message, but the demented woman has completely lost it as she starts shouting Latin. She keeps chanting and reciting, until Ralph finally shows her a picture of the engravings on Jimmy's office walls. In reaction, Jane grabs onto Ralph's hands, not letting go. She bites into it, not stopping despite Ralph's efforts to force his hand out. Throughout, Joe keeps reciting Latin verses, weakening the grip Jane's teeth have on Ralph's arms until he can finally escape. Before Ralph leaves, Jane says the name Marvin. Ralph washes his newly acquired flesh wound inside the bathroom in the facility. He then notices a quote engraved on the mirror, another mention of a door, further clarifying that a symbolic door serves as an explanation for all these events Ralph has been experiencing. Angered by Ralph's provocation of Jane, the receptionist for the psych ward threatens to complain to the precinct. Ralph ignores the old man and decides to finally be direct with Joe. He shows him the Latin writing hidden behind paint in Jimmy's office, asking if he can decipher the text to better understand what Santino is doing around the city. Joe takes a look and calls for a change in scenery to answer Ralph's inquiry. The two enter a fire station. They sit at a bar inside the station as Joe explains that the messages on the wall are an entry for spirits, existing from a time when Christianity was prevalent in the Middle East. The text before them opens a portal for supernatural spirits and demons to enter the world. Ralph tries to learn more about Joe, asking why religion is important to him. Joe mentions his journey to sobriety from leading to his current status as a priest. Moving the subject of the conversation onto Ralph, Joe wants to learn more about Ralph's attitude towards religion. Ralph does not accept that God should let evil in society thrive, especially considering the horrors he experiences daily as a cop. Joe insists that God fights injustice in the real world through heroes like Ralph, trying to help rid society of evil. Joe pulls out a recording device containing audio relevant to an exorcism he carried out. The exorcism was never something Joe considered to work. It served as an instrument for helping put Claudia, the mother of a possessed child, at ease. However, the event recorded in the tape pushed Joe into becoming a religious specialist in the police department. Ralph puts on the headphones and plays the tape. A child cries as Joe keeps praying in Latin to cleanse the child. Eventually, the mother starts crying as the child's voice changes into growls and becomes somewhat demonic. As the prayer goes on, the shrieking continues and even gets louder. Ralph stops the recording finally, when the tape overwhelms him. As he does, he hears the children's voices again. Joe disrupts the sounds as he continues his conversation with Ralph. For Joe, that event became his inspiration to become a demonology expert. He explains symptoms of possession, namely super strength, an altered voice, and clairvoyant powers. Joe asks about Marvin, the name Jane gave after their encounter. Ralph struggles to talk about it, so they move on from the conversation. The undercover cops then start playing pool, perhaps Joe's strategy to get more information from him about Marvin and the case. Joe believes that Ralph has an affinity for attracting the supernatural. Ralph gets home late at night, to his voice waiting for him in the living room. Jennifer explains to Ralph that Christina could not sleep because of scratching sounds underneath her bed. Ralph checks, but Jennifer stops him, blaming Christina's insomnia and paranoia on Ralph's absence. Ralph finally starts to open up, explaining that odd things are happening to him. His wife tries to ask for more, but Ralph holds back. Jennifer leaves as Ralph decides to check up on Christina. Ralph walks over to his daughter in bed, kissing her softly, before he notices the floor shake. He looks around to see if the floor is normal, until he sees a bloody body again. The body disappears as another illusion haunts the cop during this strange case. Back inside the facility, Jane's cell is open. One of the staff members is lying lifeless as Jane pops out of the darkness, crawling over the body and covered in blood. Ralph and Joe inspect the footage from the zoo again. The message that Jane saw that night is what caused her to become possessed. Her attempt to end her resulted from evil indulging in unexplainable destruction. The markings that Santino is drawing across town are gateways for evil spirits to enter the human realm. As the footage moves on, Ralph sees the bloody man in the footage again, but Joe does not. Ralph explains how he hears voices and sees a bloody man from time to time. This is a special gift that Ralph has, further also allowing Santino to utilize this strange phenomenon to communicate with Ralph through a spiritual connection. Butler walks into the room with more evidence. The cops now have an address for where they might find Santino. The cops go to South Bronx to find Santino, knowing that their enemy is not normal. They make sure that they wait for Santino to show himself instead of trying to breach into his apartment directly. At Ralph's house, Christina is angry at her father for missing her soccer game. Jennifer leaves Christina in her room, when suddenly the lights turn off and the door closes on its own. Jennifer is in the kitchen preparing dinner when she finally hears her daughter's screams. She runs to Christina and finds her daughter crying and scared. Joe explains that Ralph's gift could endanger him and his family. Joe tries to convince Ralph to indulge in a confession with the priest. Ralph hesitates, so Joe shares more about himself. Despite his sobriety and priesthood, he relapsed alongside Claudia a year prior. Within this relapse, he even got Claudia pregnant, who eventually aborted the child despite Joe's protest. Regardless, Joe decided to confess his sins, and he was forgiven and kept his title as a priest. With Joe's account now over, Ralph considers opening it up. However, he is interrupted by the appearance of a hooded man going inside the building. Ralph believes the man before them is Santino, and immediately runs after him. The crew is pursuing the dangerous criminal, following his tracks into a room. The lights go out as the two cops rely on their flashlights to traverse the halls. Eventually, a song catches Ralph's attention as the two enter a corridor with flickering lights. They slowly walk through until Ralph checks a door to find Santino inside an elevator. Butler climbs down the stairs as Ralph heads towards the vast and dimly lit basement. Butler is still on his way down until two moving men stop him from progressing down further because of a couch blocking his path. Meanwhile, the storm outside worsens enough to shatter windows. Joe sees this and decides to go inside. Ralph is in a corridor in the basement when he starts hearing a tune. He follows the sound and reaches the end of the corridor, where a small room holds a piano. The piano is playing itself until Santino finally shows himself before the cop. Before Ralph can process what is going on, Jimmy lunges at him from behind, giving Santino a chance to escape. Butler is almost in the basement, but Santino holds him back. They engage in combat, arm themselves, and start a knife fight. Exchanging glances at first, Butler and Santino fight evenly, until Santino tosses Butler against a wall, forcing the cop down. Meanwhile, Jimmy is holding Ralph in a chokehold. Ralph is almost about to lose consciousness, but Joe comes to his aid quickly. Joe holds a cross and chants in Latin, causing Jimmy and his grip to weaken. Ralph loses to the static sound while Joe faces off against Jimmy. Santino takes his axe to the stairs and cuts across Butler's face. Butler is helpless, as Santino takes his time stabbing through Butler's chest multiple times and taking his life. Ralph is still cowering on the floor, the sounds overwhelming him. Joe touches his cross against Jimmy's forehead, immediately incapacitating the possessed man. Joe continues to chant verses while Ralph finally collects himself. The chants eventually rid Jimmy of the spirit, finally allowing Ralph to cuff him. Ralph looks for his partner in the building, eventually reaching Butler's body too late. Ralph and Joe are sitting together in front of a cross, where Ralph decides to finally confess, from issues with his wife to his inability to hold back as a cop. Finally, the name Marvin is explained when Ralph explains how he ended a man's life in cold blood. Marvin was a pedophile and murderer, earning no sympathy from anyone. One day, Ralph was out with his family when one of Marvin's crimes was committed nearby. The sound of static and children was prominent from the crime scene, until Ralph identified Marvin in a crowd. The criminal ran away, but Ralph chased after him and beat him down until Marvin drew his last breath. With his story out in the open, Ralph indulges in Joe's company as a priest. Joe deems Ralph's actions wrong, but agrees they are not purely evil. Regardless, Joe absolves Ralph of his sins. Christina is sleeping soundly in her bed. Suddenly, her music box starts playing, waking up the child. She then notices her owl plush fall off the shelf too. The music box plays a tune slowly, until her owl plushies tumble closer to her. Suddenly, the music box opens and reveals a bloody clown from inside. Christina leaves her room, only to find Santino waiting at the end of the corridor. Ralph is still out and about, patrolling through the streets. Suddenly, he turns towards an apartment building, where a body suddenly falls and crashes on his windshield. Ralph inspects the body to find Jane lifeless on the road's asphalt. Ralph gets a call from his wife. He responds, but hears from Santino instead. Santino confesses to ending Jane's life, but Ralph is more concerned about his family. Ralph gets to his house first, immediately running inside. He opens the main entrance to reveal Santino standing in the middle of the room. Ralph immediately calls the precinct for backup. Santino threatens that Ralph needs to let Santino possess him, or he will never find his family. Ralph does not comply, cuffing the man and waiting for the rest of the authorities to appear. The cops show up in time to stop Santino from escaping, as the root of evil is finally in their hands. The cops take the man back to the precinct, with Joe present for this peculiar situation with an evil spirit. Santino is tied up inside an interrogation room, with strange dark liquid dripping down his face. Joe and Ralph walk into the room, where Ralph takes no time to begin asking about his family, but Santino only responds with a hiss. Joe starts to pray in Latin, but Santino escapes from his chair and strikes the priest across the face. The other cops in the room help bind the man down again as the other cops leave the room. With the two of them alone, they must carry out an exorcism to get answers from Santino. Joe starts explaining the procedure of the exorcism. Joe gives Ralph a text to read during their exorcism. Santino gets up from his chair from behind them, until Joe turns around and throws holy water at the possessed man. The exorcism begins as the lights in the room flicker, and Ralph struggles to stay on his feet. Eventually, everything returns to normal, as the first stage of the exorcism is over. Santino starts to act like he is unaware of anything in his surrounding. This is the next stage of exorcism, when the spirit feigns ignorance to try and escape. Joe resumes his prayer, only for Santino to start biting through the flesh off his legs. Ralph walks over to force Santino back into his seat, all while Joe continues his recitation. Eventually, the prayers seem to keep working as Santino shouts in anguish. Suddenly, Santino's head starts splitting open, a crack forming with blood slowly pouring out. The demon is finally about to talk with Joe and Ralph inside the dark room. They start communicating, as the spirit mentions Joe having a son and threatening the boy's life. Joe listens to Santino, until he loses his composure and tries to strike the possessed man. Ralph stops him in time, and the two of them realize that the demon is just trying to get a reaction out of the two exorcists. Joe collects himself and recommences the questioning. The demon stretches back, his neck pulling out of place as he does. Eventually, the spirit reveals its name, Jungler. Only Ralph can hear the spirit, so he tells Joe the name for the exorcism to continue. Utilizing the spirit's name, Joe continues exorcising the creature as both the cops brace themselves for the next stage of the exorcism. The demon now gets off his feet, still bound to the chair. Suddenly, a strong wind breaks through the windows behind Santino and shatters all the glass in the room. Ralph starts hearing loud music, forcing him into submission. Joe keeps exorcising the Jungler, despite the storm pouring in from outside. Eventually, Ralph walks over to Santino, trying to force the possessed man back onto his seat, but Santino tosses him away. However, Santino is stuck on the floor, struggling to move due to Joe's prayer and exorcism. Eventually, Joe moves closer to the possessed man, his cross firmly between them. Finally, the cross reaches Santino, as the man holds the accessory. Santino has the cross in his hands, seemingly back to normal. The spirit is gone, so Ralph takes the opportunity to ask about his family. Ralph leaves the interrogation room to retrieve his family. Several vehicles follow along with him as they reach a storage facility. The law enforcement forces all work together to eventually find one storage unit where a sealed car is kept inside. They open the vehicle while holding Ralph back to stop him from the retrieval of his family. Eventually, Jennifer comes out of the vehicle, immediately embracing her husband. Then Christina is brought out, finally reuniting the family. 7 months later, Ralph is having a baptism for his newborn daughter. Joe carries out the baptism, as Ralph seems to have embraced religion following the encounter with the Jungler. Despite the losses from the spirit, Ralph is now closer to God.